Hello there and welcome to VGC. My name's Chris Scullion. The Capcom Fighting Collection is out on the 24th of June and we've been hands-on with the Steam version for a wee while now. With about a month to go before its release, you might want to brush up on the 10 games that are included so you kind of know what to expect. So that's where we come in. This video will explain all 10 games in the collection so you've got a better idea of what they all entail ahead of its release at the end of June. So let's get cracking. Now the most kind of obvious thing when you look through the list of the 10 games is that Darkstalkers features quite heavily in it. In fact, of the 10 games, half of them, 5 of them are Darkstalkers games, which basically means you're getting the entire Darkstalkers series in this collection in one go, which is quite cool. The first game, obviously Darkstalkers, the Night Warriors. The whole series is obviously a fighting series. It's similar to Street Fighter 2, but it's got more of a horror theme. So instead of choosing from a selection of world warriors, as was the case in Street Fighter, you're instead choosing from like a bunch of monsters. Darkstalkers, the first one, was released on Capcom's CPS2 kind of arcade hardware, which was first used for Super Street Fighter 2. So it's part of that generation of Capcom arcade games that followed the Street Fighter 2 titles, the likes of Street Fighter Alpha and X-Men Children of the Atom. It's that kind of era. And so because of this, the sprites are a lot better, a lot more detailed than they were in the Street Fighter 2 games, and everything just looks really impressive. So the first Darkstalkers was a really good start to what would become an interesting series in the kind of years ahead. After Darkstalkers is Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, and although it's technically Darkstalkers 2, it's more like an enhanced update. It's sort of the Darkstalkers equivalent of Street Fighter 2 Championship Edition in that it lets you play as the boss fighters from the first game. And it's also the equivalent of Super Street Fighter 2 in that it adds a couple of new characters as well. The new characters are Hishenko, who's a Chinese vampire, and Donovan, who's a Dhampir, who's basically the love child of a male vampire and a female human. It's a kind of vampire heavy update basically. Other than the new characters, the game plays similarly to the first Darkstalkers. You can fill multiple special gauges and there's an option to turn on auto blocking, but that's about it really. The third game in the compilation is Vampire Savior, the Lord of Vampire. Just in case you didn't have enough vampires in the last game. This is the third Darkstalkers game. It's kind of colloquially known as Darkstalkers 3. And it ditches the bosses from the first game and Donovan, the kind of vampire guy who'd just been added. So it kind of undoes a lot of stuff that the second game did. But it does add 4 new characters, including BB Hood, who is objectively the best character in the entire series, because she's basically a little Red Riding Hood spoof who's armed with a big machine gun. Other new characters this time include Jeddah, who's a sort of humanoid demon thing and is the main bad guy this time, as well as a bee-human hybrid called QB, and a sort of clone of Morrigan called Lilith. The other main change is in the round system, so instead of the usual separate rounds where you get in Street Fighter games, this is more like Killer Instinct, where it's one big round and you just have 2 life bars, and when your first life bar runs out you fall down for a second, take a breather, and then it starts again. So the structure's slightly different, but the general gameplay is still quite similar. And next up is Vampire Hunter 2 Darkstalkers Revenge. Now this is where it gets quite confusing. So Vampire Savior, which was Darkstalkers 3, which we were just talking about, it got 2 arcade updates which were only released in arcades in Japan. And these were eventually ported to the PlayStation 2, but this is also only in Japan. So as such, the Capcom Fighting Collection, this is the first time both these updates will be available in the West. So the first is Vampire Hunter 2, which is a confusing title because the first Vampire Hunter was Darkstalkers 2, and this is an update to Darkstalkers 3. It's basically a big Rambo First Blood situation. The important thing is this is Darkstalkers 3's first update. And although it's technically an update, it's actually more of a rollback for fans of the original game. It ditches the 4 characters that had just been added, like BB Hood and the likes, and brings back the characters from the first game again, the ones who'd already been scrapped, but it keeps the Killer Instinct style 2 round system, so it's a bit of a weird kind of mix mash of it brings back the old characters but keeps the new mechanics, so it's a strange one. That was then followed up by Vampire Savior 2, The Lord of Vampire, which brings back the new characters again because it's just all over the place, but also includes the Darkstalkers characters from the first game who had been ditched before. But it then cuts 3 other characters, so it cuts John Talbane, who's like a werewolf, Riku, who's like a merman, and Sasquatch, who's a Sasquatch, obviously. So because of this, there's no really definitive version of the third Darkstalkers game. You've got these 3 different versions, which have slightly different rosters and make slight tweaks to the moveset and stuff like that. So you could kind of argue that these 2 updates, Vampire Hunter 2 and Vampire Savior 2, don't really count as proper extra games in the compilation. So you may want to look at Capcom Fighting Collection not as like a 10 game compilation, but more as an 8 game compilation with a couple of kind of bonus Japan only updates to Darkstalkers 3. That's probably a sensible way of looking at it. Now that all the Darkstalkers stuff's out of the way, it's time to look at the other games in the compilation. The first of which is Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, and this is a kind of cheeky one to have in here because it's not actually a fighting game, despite the compilation being called the Capcom Fighting Collection. It's more of a puzzle game where you choose from a selection of Street Fighter and Darkstalkers characters, and then it's your typical kind of Puyo Puyo, Columns Tetris, Dr. Mario type situation where you just drop gems into a well and try and form little square shapes with them before triggering them with these kind of crash gems they're called, and that makes them disappear. So if you position these special gems in a certain way, you can create big combos which send a lot of debris to your opponent's screen. Meanwhile, as you're doing all this, a little chibi Street Fighter and Darkstalkers characters you've chosen fight each other in the middle of the screen, so it's fun enough. But like I say, it's a puzzle game rather than a fighting game, so if you're a fighting game diehard, you might be a bit annoyed that it's been included in here. If you like that kind of chibi art style though, but would actually rather play a fighting game, that's where Super Gem Fighter Minimix comes into it. This is a really cute fighting game with a simplified control scheme. You've got like a punch, a kick, a throw and a taunt button, and that's it. And because it's a more cartoon style, there's lots of funny wee animations that are less realistic than usual. Not that Street Fighter was realistic in the first place, but you know what I mean. So there's all these kind of weird moves, and some of them like morph your fighters into other Capcom characters for a laugh. So Chun-Li's got this really cool combo where she turns into Jill Valentine from Resident Evil for a second and fires a bazooka at her opponent. So this one might not be the one that all the fighting game purists run to when they get the Capcom Fighting Collection, because it's not quite as complex as the other ones that are in here. But in terms of just having a casual game with friends, it's one of the most entertaining games on offer, I would say. Next up is Cyberbots Full Metal Madness. This one's a bit of an acquired taste, so your mileage may vary depending on how well you click with it. It's another fighting game, but this time you're fighting in giant mech things. This one's also got simplified controls with 2 attack buttons, a button for firing your weapon and a boost button. Because you're dealing with robots, the action's a bit slower and clunkier, but it's quite satisfying when you defeat an opponent and just explode in a massive boom. Cyberbots was released in arcades outside of Japan, but it's quite a limited release, and it was never ported to consoles in the West, so while this technically isn't the first time it's been released outside of Japan, its Western arcade run was so limited that it might as well be. Next is Red Earth. Now this one's definitely an interesting addition because it's never been released on home consoles in any region before. And what's more, it was only released in arcades in Japan and North America, meaning it's completely new to Europe. It's a fighting game, surprise surprise, where you only get to choose between 4 characters. There's a kind of lion man, a ninja, a sorcerer and a martial artist, and each character has their own separate storyline. So there's 8 kind of boss characters you fight in a row, but each character fights them in a different order, and there's different cutscenes in between. And because they're only bosses and you can't control them, they're really big, weird and wonderful creatures. There's a massive T-Rex, there's a big kraken that you fight, there's an Egyptian sphinx thing. The big gimmick Red Earth has is that characters can level up and earn new abilities, so you can also enter a password, which is like a 6-digit PIN number, which stores your progress. This meant back in the day you could leave the arcades and come back another day and keep leveling up, which was quite cool. So Red Earth is an interesting one. It's probably not the best fighting game in this collection, but it's certainly one of the better looking ones and one of the rarer ones, so it's a good one to have in here. And finally, you can't have a Capcom Fighting Collection without having at least one Street Fighter game in there, so we've got Hyper Street Fighter 2, the Anniversary Edition. This is a really curious edition because it wasn't included in the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection from a few years back, even though it's technically the 6th and final version of Street Fighter 2. In fact, this is actually the first time it's been re-released in 18 years. The last time it was ported was on the PS2 and the original Xbox. It's basically the definitive version of Street Fighter 2 in that it not only includes every character but every version of them from all the previous games. So it's got every version of, it's got like Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting aka Turbo, Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. All those versions of each character can be selected in the game as well. So if you were always adamant that, say, the Champion Edition version of Ken was the best one, you can put him up against the likes of the Super Street Fighter 2 version of Chun-Li. It's a pretty niche concept, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, and if nothing else, it's great to see this version of the game getting an airing for once, instead of the usual Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition Turbo that you always get in these Capcom compilations. And that's it, that's all 10 games in Capcom Fighting Collection. Like I say, it's out on June 24th, and we'll obviously have a full review nearer the time, so you can see if everything works as well as it should. Everything you've seen in this video has been from a preview version of the Steam version. We weren't running emulators in here. This is the actual Capcom Fighting Collection you've been watching. So hopefully the signs are good so far if this is the kind of game you're into. But like I say, come back to VGC nearer release and we'll have the full review for you. Thanks guys, bye bye.